All right, so I'm here with Jon Kinzenbaw, and for those of you that don't know him, he was founder of Kinsey Manufacturing, but I don't know if everybody knows you're a farmer too.
Oh, yeah.
So you grew up on a farm.
Yep.
What kind of farming did you guys do?
We had everything. We had some cattle and some hogs and corn and corn, oats, and hay. We didn't have soybeans till later on, but we eventually had some soybeans and some of that.
So was cattle were just beef cows and steers?
Dad milked a few when I was really younger. Before I was old enough to milk, I remember he had a dozen Holsteins that he milked, and then he got to, instead of milking the Holsteins, he got to feeding out 50 head of either heifers or steers every year, and then he'd raise hogs. We'd have sows, and we'd raise some pigs and feed them out. That was kind of what we were used to. We had a few chickens when I was a kid, and so learned all about the old small 160-acre farming operation at that time.
Yeah. So you said in your book that your dad's farm wasn't big enough where you were just going to come back and farm with your dad.
He told me, he said, any way I could start you farming, he said, you might as well get a job. So I did. And I worked for an IH dealer for a year. I worked in an automotive shop for a year. I pumped gas and fixed truck tires for about a year. And then I went into the Army Reserves for 6 months. And then I came back and borrowed the $3,500 and started welding and repair shop.
So when you started the shop, was the idea just to have a welding shop, or was the idea to start being able to have income to start on your own farming?
I don't think I intended to go farming with it, but I did not have any idea what I would do ultimately. I just wanted to fix things, and I got to doing. I learned at the IH dealership how to overhaul an engine and a transmission and a rear end of a tractor, and I had learned how to grind the valves and change sleeves and pistons, and so I'd learned a lot of the basics in that 1 year I was at that dealership, and so that carried on into that little shop in Ladora, Iowa.
So when did because you bought some farmland then later on, right?
Yep.
And so when did you start farming for yourself?
69. I bought a farm in 68, and I bought my dad's farm about that time. And then I bought a little bit of machinery, and I started farming in 69 and 70.
What'd you have for tractors when you started out?
I had, I think I had a 40-20, a couple of 40-20s maybe, and by that time I had been putting in some engines, like 45-20 engines were flipped over out of the 45-20s, and I put a couple of them in some 40-20s, takeouts, and put them in 40-20 gas tractors, an example. So I was using them on the farm.
Yeah, because guys were repowering the 45-20 with
That's
the Detroit,
right.
So you had the
takeout engine.
Yep. Okay, so they were, well, in 69, a 45-20 was brand new.
That's right.
And I suppose, you could find a early with hydraulics on the dash, 40-20 gas was probably pretty cheap.
Yeah. 40-20s at that time, I think, were, just a guess, they were around $6,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I gave I think $9,000 for my first couple of new 45-20s. They were 45-20 power shifts, and I bought a pair of them new, and I repowered them and then resold them with Detroit engines in them.
How'd the power shift hold up?
Oh, that was really the best way to go. You didn't have a clutch to deal with, and it held up real well. You didn't have any trouble with the transmissions. Same way the 50-20s. They were gear drive, but they held up very well. You never had any worries on transmission rear ends on any of those.
Yeah. That's interesting. Oh, in the original welding shop, I wanted to ask you this forever. the original sign says, Jon Kinzenbaw welding, right? But it's a Badger farm equipment sign. Were you a Badger dealer?
Took on a Badger dealership at that point, and I sold some forage wagons, and I sold some silo unloaders, and I think that was the main thing that they had. I think maybe a wagon running gear, a few of those.
Sell any barn cleaners?
Any what?
Any barn cleaners?
No.
Okay. So silo unloaders, that's work.
Yeah.
Silo unloaders don't break at the bottom of the silo, and they don't break in the warm weather.
Yeah, the worst part about a silo, I never had to work on any of them, but I did have one I put up one time. It was an old clay tile type structure, that old hollow tile.
Yep.
And I went up on that, and I put a hook over the side of it and a pulley, and I had somebody down below pulling the parts up to me with the pickup truck, and I'm sitting on the rim of that silo, and I got thinking afterwards, if he'd have overshot that, he could have pulled the side out of the top of that silo, and I'd have come down with it.
Right.
So there was a lot of, had to put the tripod up, and then I believe we put the unloader together inside the silo, and unless it was full, then we had to pull it up on the outside and assemble it up on top of the silage.
Right.
Yeah. I only did a couple of them, so I don't really remember a lot about it.
Probably wasn't your favorite job to do.
No.
And what a time, late 60s for farm automation was taking off. I mean, were there quite a few dairy farms in this area?
Not really. There was there was one there east of the town of Ladora, up high on a hill. The Tompkins had a pretty good sized dairy, and that was about the only one. Another guy out south of Ladora had a few that he milked. I don't remember whether it was 40 head or what it was, but those are the only two that I'm aware of.
But there were still a lot of guys probably feeding steers and
and then there was a few guys had a few cows,
Yep.
Yeah.
So that was farm automation between, silo unloaders and bunks and guys filling upright silos with self-unloading forage wagons was a big deal. What a change that was from the silo filler and
Yep.
Probably a good time to be in that, but then you didn't keep selling Badger real long then?
No. Wasn't anything exciting about selling that stuff, but my uncle, my dad's brother, they were about the same age, and they were always working on something, building something to make farming easier. And I remember they went to chopping hay way back in the early 50s, and they took they called it the scratcher, and it was a pair of channel irons that ran out the length of the wagon box on the front of a tractor loader, and then they had a web on it with beaters off a manure spreader that would go around the length of that. Well, it was probably up to 20 feet long, and then they run it off the belt pulley. So they'd drive in, they'd open the back doors of the wagon, back it up to the hopper on the blower, and then they would set this thing down on one side, and it was half the width of the load, so they'd take it down halfway, and then they'd back out and move over and take the other side down all the way. That way it didn't cave over on top of we call it the scratcher, that unloaded. So we never had to pitch anything out of the wagons at all. And I remember if a chunk had come off too big for the blower to swallow, that would be a problem. But they also put a beater on the hopper of that blower, and later on, some of the major companies had those on the blower, but it was just ran off a chain off of the web, so that it would paddle that back, so that it was only allowed to be about a foot deep on that hopper, so it wouldn't plug the blower. And so there's a lot of things that farmers invented, and my dad and uncle were always into some of that kind of stuff, because you couldn't buy what you needed, but they certainly wanted to make it easier.
The advancements that we saw, I say this all the time, there's about, from the time Jesus is born till about the next 1,700 years, farming didn't change a whole lot. And then it dramatically
Started to
changed.
change, yeah.
And we've seen,
One of the early inventions on a plow, of course, was the fact that somebody took a saw blade and put the steel on it instead of the old cast iron plow bottom. That steel would polish and shine up, and they learned that early on. And the next thing that I remember, when they had what we called the sulky plow, they learned that they could have a two-bottom, horse-drawn, and by sitting on the tail of that plow, that tail wheel running in the furrow would hold that side friction. The landslide or landslide on the bottom was crowded against the wall of the furrow. And by having that wheel sloped and adjusted right, it would help to hold that friction away. Instead of a friction, it would be a rolling wheel. And the man sitting on it made it more effective. And so he literally could ride for free sitting on back of that two-bottom sulky plow.
instead of putting a parasitic load on,
That's right.
you know,
Yep. And walking behind it, he could sit on it.
right? But then once tractor power came out, the efficiency of the farmer and the productivity, because you were no longer raising food, or, you know, you weren't raising the fuel for your farm equipment anymore. You were selling that
Yeah.
feed that you were previously.
Yeah.
So farmers drove a lot of the innovations in equipment. And I know that's one thing in your book, you talked about a lot of ideas came from some of your customer farmers, and you said you always recognize that. Did you end up paying farmers for some of the ideas, or?
Not really. No, I didn't really patent many things early on in the first place, but I would say that 95% of ideas used in agriculture come from the farmer, and they're the ones that come up with the idea or invented it and made it work. The majors usually, your tractor companies, usually took the idea that the farmer had and maybe refined it or maybe just added some paint to it. But farmers were the ones that invented things. They're the ones that had a need, and they're the ones that wanted to solve the problem.
Yeah, they were kind of the R&D. I mean, it was real common for somebody to buy a piece of farm equipment and then cut and weld and torch to make it all work a little bit better.
That's right. Yep.
So you're farming in 69 is when you start.
Yep.
That was fairly good times for agriculture, wasn't it?
I don't remember a lot about the grain prices. Basically, I was doing a little bit of farming, but I'd been doing some custom work. Not custom farming, but I was doing custom work. I was applying anhydrous for some guys out of a co-op there in town, and I had been doing some, I'd built a 30-foot disc that looked a lot like a Krauss disc, only mine was a little bigger, and I had spray nozzles on it and saddle tanks on the tractor, and I had a repowered 4520 or repowered 5020, either one, and I'd go out with that disc and I would spray and incorporate Teflon, and then I got to doing Sutan atrazine on the corn ground. And early days when Teflon came out, they wanted it incorporated almost immediately, and so they had a local co-op had a boom on a pickup truck, and they were spraying, and then they had 2 and sometimes 3 farmers following with a tractor and disc to incorporate it. So what I was able to do was to have the sprayer right on the front end, leading edge of the disc, tanks on the tractor, and I was 30 foot wide, and I could go in and do that faster than they could do it with 3 or 4 guys at that time. So I had all the work I could do, custom applying Sutan atrazine on corn and Teflon on beans, and I also, earlier on, I was putting on anhydrous. I built my own anhydrous applicators, and I was the one that put the first rolling coulter on ahead of the knives to cut through the corn stalks so that stalk didn't drag on that shank and freeze a gob of frozen mud and dirt on the shank and leave a nasty furrow, so that the anhydrous wouldn't seal. By running that coulter ahead of it, that sliced through it. And we pioneered that, and then everybody started using it. And after that time, the major companies like DMI and those used that coulter on the anhydrous applicators that they were building.
Did you patent that?
No.
Probably should have, huh?
Oh, I suppose there's a lot of hindsight, but yeah.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't make any difference if I did. The big companies would take it if they wanted it and run with it.
Yeah. So, 1972, the Great Russian Grain Robbery happens, and commodity prices start to take off. Summer of 72. Was business growing really fast in that time frame?
I don't know how to gauge that because I always had more than I could do. And I hired a few people as I went along, but the shop was full. I built a new building. I believe that new building was built in '69, and it was 50 by 100. And that wasn't very big by today's standard, but it was bigger, quite a bit bigger than what I started out with. And we had, I think, 3 or 4 employees, and we were doing our regular overhauls and work for the local farmers, but I got to doing more and more of the repowers, and eventually went away from the repair business and strictly went into repowering and then a little bit of manufacturing.
Did you have to kind of cut back on doing the custom work or at that point too, or?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
Were you farming a little more then?
Oh, possibly. I don't remember doing a lot for myself, but I was doing some. And the custom work, I probably was still applying some anhydrous at that point. And it was a conflict. I mean, you had more than you could do in the shop and more than you could do with the custom work. So you kind of had to decide which way to go. And I think I eventually settled more toward manufacturing than I did the custom farming.
Well, and probably in the long run, a lot more lucrative. Custom work has a tendency to be a cheap way to, generate revenue, because a lot of times it's just somebody trying to cover costs of owning a piece of equipment, so they're willing to do it fairly cheap.
Well, and they were trying to get, when it got late, they needed help. Well, everybody did. So it was feast or famine. If the spring was early and they're getting by, you may not have enough to do, but as it got later, you had more than you could do. So it was always a problem.
Yeah. So then, were you just, at this point now, corn and soybeans or row crops mostly, or did you have some livestock of your own too?
I never had livestock. I just did some corn and soybeans, and I was only a couple, 3 years, and then I rented out my dad's farm, as I recall, and I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I did rent out my dad's farm, and I had one farm that I bought, and I always continued to farm that, but it wasn't a lot.
And now, being that you're in the repower business and manufacturing, did you keep any personal tractors, or was everything for sale?
Well, they were always for sale, but I would try to get a couple. I usually had a couple of repowered tractors to go into the spring work with, and I'd do the work with them, and then I'd sell them before before fall, and then I might start over and build a couple more. I always had a couple of fresh ones that I built for myself as well as for the customers.
Did you keep any of those early tractors of yours at all?
No.
Have you been able to find any of them?
I've got one 5020 that I did, I believe, in 1972. I recognized it because I had built a special end on the throttle linkage, and I bought it back sometime early on, and that tractor is the one that I still have in the collection that was repowered, and I refurbished it again and put on different wheels and tires, and it's sitting over in the museum right now.
That's the one over there, okay.
Yeah.
And I noticed that as a kid, when you'd see like a 50-20, 60-30 or something, you always thought, boy, that's a massive tractor, And I was looking at the axles on that today. versus what you see on a row crop tractor today. And I mean, those axles look tiny. You know,
they're still kind of puny. They're 3 5/8, I believe, so they weren't very big.
No.
Now the bigger tractors all have at least a 4-inch axle or more.
Yeah, and to think that stood up.
Yeah.
Which maybe it helped it too, being a 2-wheel drive tractor, that there's a limit to what you can, there's slip. Slip probably helps them live too.
Somewhat, I suppose, yeah. But John Deere early on said, I didn't have 300 horse. If I did, you couldn't get enough duals on it to hold that kind of power. I went to the Farm Progress Show in spite of that in 1971, right up here at Van Horn, Iowa, pulled a 7-bottom plow with a 50-20 with a pair of 30.5s on it, had quite a bit of weight on it, and we showed the boys how to plow.
Yeah. So did the repowering change though when, which eventually led to more repowers, but when Deere introduced the 70-20 and the 75-20, that probably started to cut into the market share of the 60-30 and that 50-20 kind of market. Guys started going to 4-wheel drives, right?
The 60-30 solved a lot of the 50-20's engine problems. It had more power, but it also had I think they sprayed oil up under the piston off of the rod, and that oil cooled the bottom of that piston, and that 60-30 engine would last. And the 75-20 had the same engine, and it did a pretty good job. The problem was they put that engine, that 619 engine went into the 86-30, but they used the block as the frame for that big front axle, and that's where they started twisting and shaking and working that block, and that's when they started creating a lot of troubles with the 4-wheel drive engines in the 86-30s and some of those.
Because the 75-20 didn't fail a lot, or
they didn't have the weight of a 86-30, and they didn't have that block entirely as the frame. Like they used it more of a frame. The 86-30 had a 1/4-inch skin on it made it look nice, but it wasn't stiff enough to help that block. That block had to stand that 10,000 pounds of front axle twisting and rocking up front.
Yeah, because they rode nice because they had an oscillating front axle.
Yeah.
But
when they would turn and hit the stops, it would shake that block, and when it would rock left and right, it would twist on that block, and that would work that block like a pretzel, and pretty soon they'd blow a head gasket or they'd spit a rod out the side. We did a lot of those early on with the engines ruined just because of the twisting and rocking of it.
How fast were they going down? Because they were introduced, they would have been introduced, 77? 78?
I believe that's right, yeah.
Were they dropping pretty fast?
Oh, there was a lot of them around. I don't know how many, but yeah, there was quite a few of them that were dropping out, yep.
And I know in the book you show you were moving your parents' house. That was was that an 80?
I just stock 86-40, I think, 30 or 40, I forget which.
And that wasn't, because that one wasn't repowered yet?
No, I don't believe it was.
Okay. So did you just buy that tractor to farm with, or?
I think I bought it to farm with. The first 86-30 I bought it to farm with, and then I traded it for an 86-40 to farm with, and then we went back and bought an 86-30 back and repowered it right here at the farm shop, and then later on I repowered that 86-40 the same way.
Okay. So you had bought the 86-40 brand new?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which, that was a big tractor.
Yeah.
So that was your big horse then. At that time, you probably, when did you start the folding toolbar came in late 70s,
75.
right? 75.
Yep.
So then from 75, you had your own planter then.
Yeah.
How many row planter were you running back then?
Probably a 12 row.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in I know a lot of the pictures that shows you with the early folding planter with a 4430, was that your planting tractor?
Yeah, I planted, one year I had a rear fold planter with dry fertilizer on it, and I had a 4430 that I had rebuilt. It had burnt in a barn fire, and I put it in my basement. I still lived in town at the time, and I took that tractor down to the bare block and the bare rear end housing and built it back with all new bearings and whatever components and seals that it needed, and put that tractor together, and then we hooked it to that 12-row planter, and I think I planted 1,700 acres 2 years in a row with that tractor.
Which, I suppose with dry fertilizer, there's some hills around here too.
Yeah.
Did you turn her up a little bit then?
Oh, we always had them jacked a little, yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say, that'd probably be a load for a 4430 with,
Yeah.
especially with dry
I
fertilizer.
still got that old 4430. It's in my collection.
Okay. Was that a quad or power shift?
It was a synchro range.
Oh, it was a sync.
But it was when 4430s came out and they were getting list price plus 10%. And this guy bought it. He lived up by LeGrand, Iowa. And he had put the 44 on the plow, and he did a little fall plowing with it. And then he backed it in the barn and went to Florida. While he was in Florida, a snowstorm come up, and the wiring to the barn got to working where it went into the barn, set the barn on fire. And during that snowstorm, that barn burnt completely to the ground and toasted that tractor. But the fire department never got there. They didn't even know about it. So as a result, that tractor did not have a cracked block. If the fire department got to those, they'd crack the block about every time with the fire truck. You can't spray cold water on a red hot block. But that tractor survived that, and I gave $600 for that tractor, put it in the basement, and rebuilt it from scratch.
So the castings, front axle casting was good, and the did you buy a new sound guard cab for it?
Yes, I did. Put a new cab on it, and later on I had to put new rear axles were warped, and they walked, and I had one brake finally. And then the front end, I was having trouble with front wheel bearings, and I found out that the spindle was warped between the two bearings, and so the bearings were running in an odd relationship.
Oh.
And so I had to put new spindles on it.
Yeah, I have heard that about tractors getting a fire, where a lot of times guys will have a hard time. The oil pan will always leak. Front mains, they can't keep front mains in or something.
Well, yeah, you got to do them right.
And the wheel bearings and the rear axles, was it it was a synchro, it was probably an early 4430,
Yes,
right?
it was, yeah.
Because they had differential problems and some final drive issues with the early ones.
Somewhat, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, this one I never had any trouble with it, transmission-wise. Early 4010s had problems, but not so much after that.
Okay. So then did you end up getting rid of this one and finding it again, or did you never get rid of this?
The 44?
Yeah.
Oh, I never sold it. I always kept it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were a handy tractor.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Which, yeah, that's how, with the whole lawsuit with Deere and everything, because if you've never read about that lawsuit.
Which one?
Well, but it's safe to say you had a complex relationship with John Deere, because obviously Deere was really good for your business early on, between repower and tractors, and then when you built your rear fold planter, if Deere had a wonderful row unit going, and you could put those row units on your toolbar, and so Deere was really good for your business there, but they also tried to run you out of business.
Well, after they found out I was going to build more than they wanted to keep the thumb. Oh, I said they wanted to keep the thumb on the bug. And when I got to building a few more than they thought I should build, they wanted to have a shortage. And so they created this row unit shortage, and I had been buying, to back up a notch, I had been buying new John Deere engines to put in 4020s. I was buying 4430, 4320 engines and 4430 engines new in the crate, and I was putting them in a 4020 gas power shifts. I did a lot of those, and the dealers got to complaining that they were losing sales on 4430s because the guy didn't trade his tractor, he just went and got an engine put in it. So they had an engine shortage, and I didn't catch on what was going on until a couple of years later when I saw engines going down the interstate on an irrigation setup. They just created that engine shortage so that I couldn't buy the engines. Well, I was already into the planter business, and that was the same way, except I caught on to what they were doing when they created that row unit shortage.
So then, and we won't rehash the whole planter shortage lawsuit, but if you haven't take time, read the book. It's a great story. But did you resent Deere then? Or
about resent, I guess I never did.
Because I mean, obviously you like John Deere tractors.
Well, I think that you buy what you have to buy. My loyalty to tractors was always red until the 4020 came out, and when I went through that situation where in the old shop in Ladora I was putting bearings and parts in the 560 rear ends because they were too light, and 560 you couldn't steer it. You couldn't put a sickle mower on a 560 and turn a square corner because you couldn't steer it fast enough. Their power steering was bad. Their brakes had that old grab the.
Well, they were a Farmall M with a truck engine.
That's right. So they had so many shortages, and they just did not upgrade anything. And then they came out with the 806, and that was the beginning of the end. I mean, they did not study the problems. And the 4010 came out, and they addressed planetary axle, hydraulic running oil brakes. They had just a whole lot of improvements, synchronized transmission, just a lot of things that they did. And when the 4020 came out, power shift, it was a slick rig if you used it around the barnyard with a loader on it. And that's when I decided the 4020 was a far better tractor than the International.
Yeah, the 4010 couldn't have been worse timing for International Harvester, because I always say that there's a lot of younger people that don't realize that they think, I mean, as far as farm equipment today is concerned, in the United States or North America, John Deere is the giant. They're the big company. But prior to, going back, say, 1958, I think in the implement business they surpassed IH somewhere in there, and then in 63 or 64 is when they passed them as far as tractor sales. But yeah. prior to that, IH outsold Deere massively.
Yeah.
And
just to throw numbers at it, the old Farmall H started out with serial number 501. Consecutively, they ran through 391,730. Well, if you only subtract 500 from 391,000, you see there was 391 plus 1,000 of those H's built. The H Farmall, in that 14 years they built H's, outstripped John Deere's A and B, styled, unstyled, both. You put all four of those John Deere models together, and you couldn't come up with the numbers that were strictly into the H Farmall.
Right.
M Farmall had almost 300,000 M Farmalls. So they were really going for it, but they were trying to do too much, and they weren't spending enough time paying attention to the market needs.
Yeah, I always said that they kind of took the farm equipment division and robbed it to finance all the other stuff that they were doing. And when the two cylinders were out, they had a superior product. But then when the 4010 came out, they were left scrambling, and from that point on, it was catch up.
Yeah.
And Deere got ahead. But I, you know, yeah, I've always wondered that if it was, you know, you like the equipment, but was there certain people at Deere, like, if you met, like at the time, if you met William Hewitt, could you guys stand to be in the same room? Because that would have been CEO at the time, right?
Yeah, and I don't know. I was pretty green as far as getting along with people, and if I'd have been 20 years older and had a little more experience, I might have told him more what I thought of his organization. But I tried to. I met him, you know, but that was about it.
Which that's fascinating, because I guess I've never heard that side of it. Because you know, there's some people out there that just have a chip on their shoulder, and I mean, I know guys that if the John Deere dealer in their town had done one thing to them, they would take. It wouldn't matter how many 560s it took. They'd just keep buying 560s instead of replacing with a 4010, just because they had a chip on their shoulder.
Yeah, yeah.
And so yeah.
We won't get into politics, but we got guys that vote the wrong way right now just because Granddad voted that way. They can't admit that there's a problem.
Right. We got the two parties, and well, this is the candidate. We're going to vote for him because this is it would be like saying I'm going to be an IH guy and sticking with that 560, and it just keeps breaking and going, well, we have IH.
Yep.
And so, okay, then, so you were an IH guy, and then, you know, and then like Deere. What did you think when the Magnum came out? When Case and IH merged, and then, because the Magnum was a pretty good tractor.
It was fair, but it still had, I had a couple, three of them brand new, but they just did not have the power shift. It didn't shift right, and there was a lot of things that I didn't care for in that tractor. So I bought several new Magnums, and then I got back over into the John Deere again later on.
Well, I always say that the 8000 series was as important as the 4010.
Yeah.
Because I think every tractor today is based off, every row crop tractor today, I think, is kind of based off that 8000 series John Deere.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
But how do you get away with a transmission, that IVT, infinitely variable transmission, in the John Deere tractors? It's got a life expectancy of anything from 1,500 to 4,000 hours. And I've got one right now out at the plant. I've been waiting on a remanufactured transmission, $40,000 exchange to put a transmission in that tractor, and it's only got 3,500 hours on it. And it's been down all season. If I was a farmer, depending on that tractor, I'd have had to buy another tractor or rent a tractor to get by, and that's uncalled for. And the cost of fixing that transmission is totally ridiculous, especially when you look at the hours. Some guys have had them go out in 1,500 hours. Beautiful transmission, but you can't afford. If I was to go out and buy another one now, I've got several of them in the test department, and if I was to go out and buy more, I avoid that transmission just because it's not dependable.
I've got an 8200 and I've got an 8225R. So that's one of them 2010 8Rs with before emissions, and I power shift in both. You know, which obviously the 8200 could only be power shift, but I stuck with the power shift, and once you got into the late ones with the power shift, boy, they really have it figured out. There's no jerk.
Yeah.
And sometimes if something works, in the same way, I'm a finger pickup planner guy. If something works, I'll stick with it.
Yeah.
You know. So then, do you have, if there's one model of tractor that's just your absolute favorite that you've had over the years, what would it be?
I think probably the 8370 RT, the
track tractor.
Track tractor. That is the slickest planting. I've got the new 8000 series quad track. My son has one of them too, and they're great on traction, and everything about them is a nice tractor, but it do not handle on a planter quite like that 2-track. That 2-track system, you can just make that planter dance right around on the end and back it in the corner, and it's slick. Slickest planter tractor I ever had, and I planted with corn with those for about 3 years.
Okay.
Or maybe more like 5 years. I forget how long I've had those. But
So your personal planter is a 24-row?
yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
are you on your planter then? Are you electric drives? Are you the latest? Are you doing R&D for the company?
Well, that's part
own?
of it. They give me a different planter all the time, and usually, like this year, we planted with 2 or 3 different ones. And if you dread starting out in the spring with a new planter, I have to do it every year because they want me to run a different one. So, but I've got a lot of people that get it set up for me, and they set everything from the marker width to the depth control to all the down pressures and all of that. So all I have to do is drive it, more or less.
That's not, well, I mean, you should. You are the boss.
Yeah.
Well, that way you got somebody, if something doesn't come up. But even then, you make sure you start. I mean, even as a planter manufacturer, you always start in the back somewhere, so if something acts up, you don't see it by the road.
I'm not lucky enough to do that. Usually right along the highway where you have a burp and the problem. Yeah. And if you don't do that, you're going to do it where the neighbors are going to see it. So
Well, there's that.
Yeah.
Now, my favorite model of tractor all time is a 4440. I've got one that's beautiful. And growing up, so I was born in 78. In the 80s, as a kid in the 80s, you didn't see a lot of 50 series because people, I mean, well, how did that affect Kinsey Manufacturing in the 80s when you went from, I think what they say from say 79 to 86, the farm equipment industry contracted 50% or better. I mean, or I think what they say at one point, at the worst of it, from the peak to the valley, it was 1/3 of the demand there once was.
We just didn't see that because we were always trying to supply, and we always had more demand than we could supply for years. And so a lot of those I don't remember because we didn't encounter that situation. We were always growing, and it was just a time when the industry slowed down, we could catch up a little bit.
Okay. So the 80s were pretty good times for you then.
Yeah.
You didn't see a lot of 50 series at first because it was, they sold more 4430s than 4440s. They sold more 4440s than 50s. But that particular 4440 that you have, is that kind of a favorite tractor somewhat, or just because of the oddity of it being rare?
Well, I don't use it, so I can't.
Yeah.
I've never used one in the field. I've got another. I probably got a couple more 40s around. I know I got one more around, but again, I'm not farming enough that I use them.
So you didn't use any 4440s when they were new?
No.
Okay.
No.
You had your 4430, and then you had 4-wheel drives for tillage.
Yeah.
Okay. You just happened to see that one was coming for sale, and where do you find a brand new 4440?
That's right. That's what I was looking for, yeah. Yeah, and that was one of them sales when I had another guy go to the sale for me, and I told him that there was 3 of them. One had 48 hours, one had 500, and one had 1,500 hours. And I said, Bill, we'd like to put that low hour one in the collection, but if you buy that one. It'll be just as cheap as the second one, because the second one will jump in and bring almost as much. And that was just about what happened. The second tractor brought almost as much money. I probably should have had Bill buy both of them that day because they're really good value at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the 4440 and realistically, I think the 4440 is probably the new 4020 as far as collecting. They were, I mean, at the time it was a record price on a 4440, but looking at today, I think you could sell it for 3 times what you paid.
Yes.
So what do you say to the people? Because I can remember guys saying, nobody's going to want to collect anything other than a 2-cylinder. If you're into Deere, you're never going to want anything newer than a 2-cylinder, right? So I hear people say to me today that they'll say, well, an 8000 series or an 8R, nobody's going to collect them. Do you think in 20 years people are going to be looking for, say, an 8530?
I don't think probably as much so as some of these older tractors, but it depends on the generation. And, I collect what I grew up with and beyond. And I think that everybody has their favorites in a given time frame. And I think it'll move along as we go forward. But again, those old hand-me-downs of the H's and M's and the John Deere 2-cylinders, those will always be passed down to kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids.
Well, they'll still run.
Sure.
You can't kill them.
Well, yeah.
I mean, the wiggle room in those engines is crazy. I mean, you don't have to be a skilled machinist to make one run again.
But you have to be pretty much an acrobat to use one with a loader on it, I'll tell you that. I'm talking about the old A John Deere.
Yeah.
You just go out here with an H Farmall and a B John Deere, say, and put a manure loader on the front of one of them. Now, show me how you're going to drive that John Deere when you got too many jobs to do. You got a hand clutch, you got a hydraulic in your left hand, a clutch in your right hand. You can kick the brakes with your feet, but when are you going to steer it?
Yeah.
So you got to let go of something to steer it. And if you didn't have power steering, you had your hands full right there. And yet the old H, I grew up with an H with a loader on it, and you had your foot clutch, your brakes with your other foot. You could steer, and you had the hydraulic lever, but you did not have that clutch to deal with. And it was just so much handier.
But you didn't have live power, so if you weren't quite quick enough to start raising the loader as you're driving towards the spreader, you're going to have to slip her into neutral quick.
Yeah. You did that with the H too.
Yeah. Dad had an M with a Paulson loader on it, and I got to run that, and I tell you what, 11, 12-year-old kid, that's all you could handle, that thing with a loader on it.
Yeah.
They were a lot. But, so you've seen the equipment grow, exponentially. Like that 8640 behind you was a massive tractor when it was new. Do you look at the progress we've made as progress, or is it kind of do you look back and go, were we better off with smaller tractors and more farmers?
Well, the farmers are expected to do more and more all the time, and I think right now, for every farmer, there's 150 people that are being fed by non-farmer, or farmers are feeding 150 people. Where at one time when we came to this country, everybody farmed.
Right.
Every individual was a farmer, and or farmer's wife, I suppose you'd say. And then gradually that changed because of mechanization and the way things go. And yet we produce record numbers of corn and soybeans and crops, but we're doing it with less and less people because we're more automated.
Right, and I wonder, because they always say we need young people involved in agriculture, but I feel like if there was more opportunity to farm for younger people, like I think there's people that are interested in agriculture, but there's only so many people that actually get to farm. And it's become, because face it, years ago, if you worked really hard, you could compete, where, now you can't,
Work isn't the answer anymore. It used to be if you worked hard, you were going to be successful at it. Nowadays, not so much. You had to be smart enough. You had to work smarter or you'd get pushed out.
Right, and the equipment allowed a bigger farmer to be bigger and
Yeah.
continue to grow. And once that farmer is that big, it's easy to add more.
Yeah.
So do you look at that sometimes and go, did we reach a tipping point where maybe we should have, would we have been better off if we never would have built anything bigger than a 40/20? Because
I don't know how to answer that. That's a good question, but
well, we're not putting the genie back in the bottle. Or
if we continued on with autonomous equipment, I've had autonomous on tractors enough to know that you can program a tractor to go out and do certain jobs. And my thought was that if you had several smaller tractors with, say, 6-row or whatever planters hooked on, a person could sit on the hill with his laptop and he could run 4 or 5 of those tractors, and if one of them broke down, the other 3 or 4 could continue to run. So, and it'd be easier to move them from one field to the next than to have the big planter that folds and all that. But I don't know. I haven't seen that happen yet, but I'm wondering if that won't happen if we go to more and more automation.
And I worry about that as far as the advent of more and more technology and everything coming. I think it's good for people to work. I think people need to work. I think they need a purpose. As you go to more and more automation and AI and everything else, do people end up losing that identity, and a sense of accomplishment they get? And basically, do we go too far with technology that people become a pet or cattle or just
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought that far. I guess I'm getting the age where I've never been out of something to do, and I suppose I still could do more. But there are people that are floundering, trying to decide where to go. How many kids go to college and they don't know what they're going to do even after they graduate from college? But they sure know how to listen to some of those idiots and start demonstrating at the college level. And if I was parents and I had a kid that was out demonstrating, I'd say, that's enough of that. You buy your own way, and they wouldn't be near as apt to do that if they had to pay their own way.
Well, it's kind of like complaining about what you're eating. If you're hungry enough, if you worked hard enough, it's all tastes okay.
Now they say there's people who think they can't lose any weight, but I've been around enough videos and movies on concentration camps and people left in captivity, and you've never seen a fat person come out of captivity on some of them places yet.
Right. No, I think when we all had enough to do in life, as far as when life on the farm was just survival and it was in a lot of physical work and everything else, I think people didn't have enough time to worry about some of this other stuff. Yeah. So I worry about that going forward, that as the farms continue to grow, because once you get more autonomous, obviously the biggest operators will, easily outcompete everybody.
Yeah.
And that's scary, but that could be any business. I mean, I don't think today you could just start a Chevrolet dealership either, from scratch,
Well, you could if you didn't have the company dictating what you're going to do. That's the problem I'm seeing. I've got a situation right now where I happen to like red for a color on a pickup, and I've always driven a red Chevy pickup, and I like that big engine in it. So in order to get the red and the big engine, there's certain things I can't get. I can't get power seat on the right side. I can't get power tilt on my steering wheel. I can't get the power fold on my mirrors. They've deleted those 3 main things on that particular model pickup. And why would they do that? And that's been going on now. The pickup I'm driving is that way. Now, if I settled for a smaller engine, I could get the power seat and some of that. But it's we even looked at GMC, and my local dealer can't help me in that area either, because they will not put that combination together in that bright red color. What is going on with some of those companies, I do not know. But that's the problem with trying to take on a dealership. They dictate what the dealer can and can't do.
Yeah. Well, and you run into that in your business, I'm guessing, with being, because you're a short line, so you have a dealer that's a full line dealer that wants to start selling your product, then the full line says no. And that's because you have your own dealership now, don't you?
Oh yeah, we got quite a few dealerships, but usually they're in another major brand. We had a lot of international, still have a lot of international dealers, Case IH dealers that are Kinsey dealers. There's a lot of the New Holland dealers that are Ford and Kinsey, but there are more and more of them are getting where they want their equipment. If they've got a planner, they're trying to dictate what you can do with it.
Yeah. Well, and has it been tough? So early on in the planner game, you needed hydraulic hoses and a drop in. You know, now is it getting harder and harder to adapt your planner to fit everybody else's tractor?
Somewhat, although we have an electronics division, and one of the unique things that we have in keeping help interested is that we have the idea for the invention. We take the idea through the drafting and engineering side of it. We build the prototype. We go out and test it around the different parts of the country. Then if we like what we have, we manufacture it. And right now we manufacture our own hydraulic cylinders. We manufacture, in one of our divisions, our own monitor. We've got another division that's working on wire harnesses, because we can do better with that. But if you come to work for us, you can look around and see the idea carried all the way through the sale and the service after the sale. And if you work for one of the majors, you might get stuck in a factory that builds engines or maybe builds certain parts of a planter, but not one that really designs and builds everything from scratch.
Yep. So that's a challenge to, make everything come together with this guy's got a Fendt, and this guy's got a Deere, and but you're nimble enough that you can do that in-house.
Pretty much, there's things that you rely on others to do, but we still, when I started in the business, my first objective was to do what I could do myself. And I soon found that I needed help to do the things I didn't have time to do. Later on, after I hired people to do the things I didn't have time to do, I also had technology that I didn't, and things I didn't know how to do. So then I'd specifically hire somebody that could do that particular type of work. And so you surround yourself with people that can do what you don't have time to do, and people that can do what you don't know how to do. And if you're a manager or an owner of a company and you're afraid of somebody coming in there smarter than you are, you got problems. You've got to hire people for what they can do, not necessarily worry that they're going to come up with an idea that you don't have.
Well, you've had employees that have gotten some patents for you.
Oh, sure. Yep.
What a good thing. Where if you let your ego get in the way, you wouldn't have those.
The first main example of that was that soybean meter. It had one moving part, and it went around through the seed reservoir, and the seeds are held in place by the brush. The only moving part was the disc. And that was a guy that came to me with an idea, and he came to me and said, I've got this idea, but my company I'm working with won't let me give me the time and the money to pursue it. And I said, well, why don't you come to work for me, because it sounds like you got an idea that'll work. So he came to work, and I put him over here at the farm shop so he could be left alone so he could work on it. And he come up with that bean meter that was just slick as could be, and we still sell those by the thousands every year because it's a very, very good way to plant soybeans. Our competitor built one, they called it a radial meter, and it's shaped more like a bowl. Yep. Theirs was never as successful as the one that Harry had built, but Harry was just one of those guys that I didn't care if it was his idea or mine. We got along real well with it.
Yeah. So then, all through this time frame, you're still farming.
Well, not as much. I don't farm myself anymore. I've got 8 to 10 people that rent ground from me because I've gotten basically clear out of it, except that I do plant corn sometimes for my daughter who rents 3 or 4 farms from me, and I plant some corn and beans for my son who comes down here and rents some ground from me because Jonathan lives up by Des Moines and farms quite a bit up there, but when he comes down here, I'll help him put in a crop, and he might use his own planter or he might use an experimental planter on some of that. And of course, Susie uses an experimental planter and plants a lot of her own crop, but I also plant and harvest some of hers.
Well, so when you were buying farms in the area, did you have to be careful that you didn't, because you're in the business of selling stuff too, you didn't want to step on too many toes of customers? Did you always have to be mindful of that?
Yep,
too?
Sure. You have to be careful what you're doing. I don't try to buy a farm out from under somebody who's trying to get started or who somebody is trying to get their kids started, but there are exceptions. There are times you just have to, if the land joins you and it suits your needs, sometimes you go ahead, but I've been able to get along pretty well. You can satisfy most of the people most of the time, but there's always a few that you'll never satisfy, and so sometimes you just have to look the other way and keep on going.
So did you ever reach a point where, Kinsey Manufacturing is doing really well? Like all the off-farm stuff I've done over the years, I do drain tiling and stuff, and the goal is always just to get back to just full-time crop farming. Did you ever reach a point where you went, I could just do this now, and did you consider getting out of the business and then just sitting back and farming?
How do you get out of something that's bigger than you are? I mean, it's gotten to where a lot of people depend on that for a job, and we got a lot of customers, a lot of dealers, and a lot of things that depend on what we're doing out there, especially our employees. And so we keep it going and try to keep the management so that we can grow with it and keep it going. And of course, Susie is now my president of the company, and I've got a COO who does a very good job, and try to fill all those positions with somebody that can do. Right now, just this morning, my HR manager and I were talking about some people that are getting up to close to the retirement age. You have to figure out what you're going to do to replace some of those people before you're caught without somebody filling that position. But you've always got, in our case, I've got a lot of lead men, foremen in the plant. They pretty well know who their star workers are, who they would want to promote. And so you have to have a lot of people promote from within whenever possible. And we've also got a couple of people on the outside looking for hiring for people that we need. And we bring in interns from these colleges. And when you bring in, just last night we had a cookout for our new interns, and there was 21 new interns, co-ops, whatever you want to call them, that are here for anywhere from 4 months to 6 to 8 months at a time. They might be freshmen in college, they might be a junior in college, and we found that Some of those you bring them back more than once. I had one guy that was an intern here 4 times or 3 or 4 times in a row, and now he's been working for us for 5 years. So you can find a lot of people in those areas, and that's how you bring in people to find out what they can do.
Have you ever taken somebody that's worked for you and put them through school to?
Oh, you might say I don't know if I can't think of any examples right now, but yeah, that's very possible. We have done that. We send them out to learn how to do things or send them to certain classes or whatever, but mostly we bring in people that can do, and or they're highly recommended by somebody.
Because I remember reading years ago, like in the 50s or whatever, I think around the time that like William Hewitt became CEO of Deere, it was it was rare for somebody to have a college education to be on the board of directors at Deere, because most of the guys were self-made men whose company had got bought by Deere or, etc.
Yeah.
Did Deere ever approach you to buy you?
Oh yeah, there was a few times, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
A few of them I probably knew about, and probably some times that I didn't. But I was never for sale, so it didn't make any difference.
Yeah, which is pretty cool that you liked it enough to.
Yeah.
Well, and like you said, I guess that's something you don't think about is you have employees that are counting on you. It becomes a responsibility, to keep those guys working. I think I remember reading some of the farm equipment manufacturers in the 80s that got really slow. They started, building RV chassis or anything to keep the workforce.
Well, that's true, and we would look at some of that stuff too from time to time, but you have to have something that fits your ability to manufacture. I don't like to get too far off in left field because it takes away your thought processes and the direction you're headed. And I've always said I'm interested in things that plant crops, especially row crops, and probably in this case things that haul grain away from combines. So the planters in the spring and the grain carts in the fall. Now we have that mock till, which is a very, very good tillage system for both spring and fall. And basically now I wouldn't need anything except planter, the mock till, the planter, and the grain cart to do what I need to do.
Because, agriculture is cyclical.
Yeah.
So having, I suppose, the planting and the harvesting, it gives you something in the off season from the other one.
And of course we extend the planter out. We'll get done with grain carts here probably in July, and then we'll start right in on next year's planters. So we'll build planters usually 8 months out of the year, and maybe grain carts only 4 months out of the year.
How far out are you right now on planters? Like if somebody wants to order a planter, would they get it built for 2025's crop?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know for a couple of years there, everybody was so far out on orders, but
yeah.
that So
and we've never gone to a Farm Progress show with an order book. We don't go to the shows to ask for ads or for sales. We go there to advertise and show what we have, but we don't go there with high pressure sales. Some might think that's the way to go, but we like to show them what we have and then let our dealers, do what they need to do to sell.
Yeah. That's a good way to look at it. Plus, you had some fun at the Farm Progress shows in the past with the repower tractors and Big Blue and.
Oh yeah, that's been interesting. Yeah.
Where were you? Which back in the day, was there a GM truck dealer that you were getting all those 318s and 350 Detroits from? Or?
No, we bought them different places. A lot of those engines we rebuilt or overhauled the Detroits. And then the Cummins engines, we did over 600 of the John Deere four-wheel drives in that 10-year stretch of time that we did those, and those engines were, most of the time, were remanufactured engines by the Cummins engine company.
Recon.
Recon or Reman, yep.
Okay, so you were getting those right from Cummins?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so the Detroits back in the day were generally used engines when you got them.
Pretty much. I bought some out of Kansas City Diesel, some new ones. I bought some out of Hicklin, Des Moines when they were a General Motors dealer. But I think I even bought some out of a local dealer out of Grinnell, Iowa, as I recall. But most of those Detroit engines, you could get them out of a wrecked semi-truck at one time. There were a lot of, we call them the Ruan engines. The Ruan 8V engine out of a Ruan truck was set up pretty much the way we wanted it.
Well, there were a lot of IH cabovers that ran those 4070A Transtars. A lot of them had 318s.
Yeah, yeah.
And, and Cracker Box Jimmys and GMC Astros.
Yeah.
So, did you have to switch the governor on them to like a kind of an egg governor?
Yeah, we went to a variable speed governor always. Yeah.
Okay, because on a Cummins you can't run the same pump you would on a tractor that you were going to run on a truck.
Got to have variable speed governor on either one of those engines.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. One thing I always wondered if you never put Jakes on any of those Cummins.
But what?
Put Jakes on there, Jake brakes.
What for? What reason?
Well, if you had a guy that's, say, like a hog producer with a big slurry tank or something.
Not that often. Not enough to really pay any attention to that, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
But theoretically, if you had a repower, you could.
You could, I suppose.
Switch the rocker boxes and put them on there.
Yeah.
Did you? So you said like the 8640 that you had bought new. That tractor, obviously you didn't wait till the engine failed before you repowered
Not in
it?
that particular one, no.
Did anybody buy one and have you repower it right away?
Oh, sure, I'm sure that's right, yeah.
Okay.
Usually they were used tractors, so I don't know that they bought any. I had some new 4520s bought, but not four-wheel drives that I recall.
Okay.
Usually those, enough of them failing that you keep busy doing the ones that failed.
Yeah.
And the 8850 had a V8 engine, and it was worse yet.
Right. No, I had always been told that if you had that same engine in an excavator or a dozer, they were all right.
Well, yes, that was because they weren't twisting that frame, a lot of that, like they did in the four-wheel drive.
Yeah. Now, didn't you repower an IH, was it maybe a 1256 or something?
I did the one, yes.
Was that with an IH V8?
No, that was with a 6V Detroit, 230, 250 horsepower.
Okay. I'm surprised you didn't end up repowering like a 1468 or 1568, but I suppose they just bought a DT engine and...
Well, those tractors wouldn't stand that kind of power. With that 1256, I put the third ring and pinion in it when I got it back to restore it for the collection. They had a bad transmission, weren't tough enough, nor was the rear ends tough enough to handle that kind of power.
Okay.
And I told the guy that I did that 1256 for that he needed to use a 5020, and he couldn't see his way to. He was a red man, and he didn't want a green tractor, so he stubbornly brought me that new 1256, and it didn't last him very long until he got rid of it because he couldn't keep the transmission in it.
Did you ever do any like G1000 Molines or anything?
No.
So just
they were already speeded up. They were from some of them older, smaller Minneapolis, and they kept speeding up the transmission and turning them faster to make them stand the horsepower. And I don't know how far you could have taken that, but no, they just weren't as popular a tractor.
Okay. So just mostly Deere, and then the one IH that snuck in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, obviously Deere became more and more popular, and
yeah.
So there was probably a lull in there between the 5020 and the 8630 that you didn't do much of it. And then...
Well, we quit once and then went back at it again. We quit repowering the 8Vs around 1975. And then we didn't repower again until about 1990 when we started doing the 4-wheel drives.
Yeah. I remember you had an auction a few years ago where you sold construction equipment.
Yes.
You sold an 8850 on there. Was that the last one that you repowered?
One of the last ones. It was near the end. That one and the one my son has were the last two that we did.
Okay, so you have one of the last ones you did then.
Yeah.
Okay. What'd you think when the 8960 and 8970s came out?
Well, they had Cummins engine in those.
Yep.
And that was the only problem that we had with the 8970s was those first few had a wrapper on the exhaust that would get that dust and chaff and whatever fines in it, get them red hot, and then they'd sift down on top of a hydraulic block and set them afire. And I bought two of them back to back with toasted cabs. I mean, it just burnt the tractor to nothing left of it. And I repowered two of them, and I still got one in my collection. That was an 8970, and I threw away the old sheet metal, which was all warped, and built my own hood so it looks more like the 9000 series tractors.
Did you do Bill Dietrich's one too?
No, he did that after. He did that himself. Had some guys help him with that, and he put that Caterpillar. It was a V12 engine he put in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. What does yours have in it now?
Mine's got that K series 1100.
Yep, 1150.
Cummins, 1150 Cummins. Yeah.
Yep. I bet she pulls pretty good, huh?
Yeah, it's set up with 600 horse.
Did you farm with that one then?
Yeah.
Has it held up pretty good?
Yeah, it did pretty well.
That's because I had heard people say that, like on the versatile 1150s and 1156s, they were having transmissions fail in them, and I've heard people taking 8960 24 speeds and putting them in.
Had not heard about that. That'd be quite a job, I would think.
But it sounded like the versatile, they weren't supporting that stuff.
Yeah.
And that's one advantage to the Deere is there tends to be fairly good support. I mean, as far as support for your older equipment, most of that stuff is fairly generic, ain't it?
You're speaking of what now? The
planters or?
Well, yeah, we've kept parts for our older planters way back just because people need parts, and I didn't want to leave them hanging without parts for it. So, but a lot of those parts are interchangeable. The frames, not so much, but the row unit parts and drives and some of that, all the row unit pieces, all those kind of things go all the way back anyway.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
So, of the planters you did when you went from that rear folder, what's your favorite style planter you did? Did the pick up and turn or the front fold or the? Well,
it's called the twin line, and the one that raises, simply because we could put 12 and 16 rows across the back, and we could put 11 or 15 across the front. And so the same planter would plant your corn, and then it'll plant the beans. And that's the planter that I used most of the time after we come out with that. I used one to do that on my own because then I was raising more soybeans. And we never went beyond, in production, we never went beyond 16 row because 24 row would have 7 or 47 or 48 rows, and that's just a lot of weight to transport down the road. So we never got into that area, but there's guys wanted them, of course.
And I suppose it'd take up a lot of storage room too, lengthwise.
Storage is never a problem. If you got enough acres for a big planter, you'll always find a place to put it in the shed.
Yeah. Well, did you ever anticipate? So, what's the biggest planter you built?
Well, we had some 32 and 36 rows, but there was so few, and then that went down for a while, and you just couldn't make any money building a few. You had to have something you could build 100 or more of,
Yep. So now just 24 row is
pretty popular and pretty standard.
Yeah. Did you anticipate that in 1975?
No, but my dad started out planting with a 2-row and horses. I started out with a 2-row on an aged farmall, but neither one of us would have thought. My dad lived to see the 24-row planter run, and I lived to see the 36-row planter run on some of our own land. Had an uncle. He was born in 1917. When he died in 1980, he died in 82. No, I'm trying to think. He died later than that. He had planted corn starting out at 9 years old. He planted corn consecutively for 72 years. He planted corn. The year he died, he was 82, I believe it was, and he'd planted corn that year on his own land. He planted 72 consecutive crops, all on his own land from the time he planted on his dad's farm until he planted for his son. The reason that you won't ever find that is because very, very few people ever got to plant corn at 9 years old.
Yeah.
Where my grandfather teach the boys how to do it and let them do it. And my dad did the same with me. He put me on that old H and a 2-row planter and turned me loose with it and said, go ahead and plant that field. And I have grown men around the community. I've heard that they died unexpectedly, or their dad died, and the 40-year-old guy had to have the neighbor come and show him how to plant corn because dad never showed him how.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, that was one thing going on my own that you got to learn a lot.
Yep.
And do it for yourself, and that was good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the whole dynamic changed. I mean, also the focus of commodities, So back then, most of the grain around here was probably getting fed to livestock.
Yeah, somewhat, yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
And
I didn't pay much attention where it was going. I guess I built a grain setup there of my own, and we hauled most of ours to the river.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you go to the Quad Cities?
Yeah, wherever the markets were. Of all the years that I've had grain trailers and we've hauled grain to the river for my own and my kids and all, I've never been to the grain terminal myself. I always had somebody else do it.
Okay.
Didn't care to drive a semi that much.
Okay. Well, then, did you have any cool trucks over the years?
Not really.
Okay. Just whatever worked.
Well, we always had some pretty nice semis, but I never drove them. I always had guys that were good at it. And I had one guy that could make 4 rounds to the river, and most of them could never get more than 3.
Yeah, okay.
But Mike was efficient, and he'd stay at it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, semis for hauling grain went from kind of uncommon to absolutely the way it gets done.
Yeah, when I started out, there were a lot of straight trucks, and we built a lot of 400-bushel grain carts to start with. And then as the trucks kept getting bigger, the carts kept getting bigger. Now it's rare that you see a farmer haul grain in a straight truck, almost, because you can own a grain trailer, and then you can own a semi-tractor and hook on to other trailers. Where if you got a straight truck, that's all you use it for. So the semi and grain trailer is the most popular, and there are a lot of over-the-road semis that become old enough that you can buy them right and put them on a grain trailer.
In the welding shop, did you ever do any box and hoist conversions on trucks or anything?
No, not really, no.
Okay. Never thought about manufacturing, because hopper bottoms really didn't come along right away. I mean, a lot of grain trailers were flat floor for a long time.
Yeah.
By us, I know the river used to have a hoist.
Yeah.
And
drive up there and block it and raise her up. Yeah.
Yeah, and the first time I went to unload, and I didn't have her tight up against the stops. And it slid back a few inches, and
thought she was leaving, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it worked. But yeah, so you never thought about building like hopper bottoms when you were doing grain carts or something?
No.
I suppose that's a whole different thing with getting the DOT involved.
Well, that's right. You got to have the brakes and all of that licensing and all that stuff, and lightweight. Whereas in the ag side of it, weight wasn't an issue.
Yeah, the heavier it built, the better.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's amazing what we've seen, in agriculture, and the changes in this equipment is mind blowing, and I don't know where it goes from here. But it's
depends on what happens to our country and our government. We got a lot of problems out there with what happens. I'm hoping we can get this thing turned around and survive a while. But the old adage that a nation, democracy, or whatever you want to call it, lasts about 250 years until the people find out they got the keys to the treasury and they start wanting the money for themselves, and that's when she starts going downhill. And when you have a government, when your colleges fail you, when your news media fails you, and then your government officials, they start to fail you, you've got troubles.
Yeah. So you open another manufacturing facility over...
We're in Lithuania, yes.
Were you nervous about having to deal with a foreign government that at a whim, theoretically, they could just...
You could, yeah. We researched that out, and I think we landed in the right place. But even there, if I wanted to build a set of storage racks in a factory, I probably got to write papers thick enough to make a book just to get it approved. It's just unbelievable. They want to know everything, and they want to know all the numbers. They want everything, and I don't know. We've had some success with it, but basically, it's been tough. The labor market, the labor is quite a bit cheaper than what it is over here. We've got some pretty eager people that want to work over there, but some of the red tape and the freight and shipping is a nuisance, and we sell a lot into some of those countries across Europe, but Russia, Ukraine, all those places have been a market for us. But when you got these governments that come in and blow things apart, it's tough.
Yeah. Well, I'd even heard of some of the corruption in some of these.
Oh yeah.
Well,
Ukraine was fairly corrupt. If you want to look at it from that standpoint, Ukraine's not their government is not the most up and coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a guy by us that was farming in the Ukraine, and he said he got out because they started to just take things from people.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean. It'd be a pretty scary thing to invest. That will you be able to recoup?
Yeah.
But if it's worked out for you, then So, yeah, you look back at it, it's probably been quite a career in agriculture. Probably wouldn't do it any different.
Well, I don't know what, you might. Well, there's some things I do different with the hindsight, but if I didn't have the hindsight, you probably wouldn't do it a lot different.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk about this. That's there's a lot of stuff that I'd always wanted to know, and I don't, like I said, I've never heard anybody ask you about Badger farm equipment, but I
Yeah.
You probably didn't think you were going to talk about silo unloaders.
Well, no, not really, but whatever.
And that's interesting. I always wanted to know the dynamic with Deere, because it's good to know you didn't hold a grudge.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Well, thanks, John.
You bet.